The last few videos, we've been creating this selection manager using the solid principles, which means it's really easy to create and implement new behaviors. But what's not easy is setting up those behaviors in the scene. It's a very hands-on process in which I have to go into the hierarchy, find the selection manager, and replace the behaviors that I want by hand. So in this video, we're going to try to make a simple tool that'll live in the editor that's going to make it really easy to hot swap behaviors on the fly. My name is Charles, and this is Infallible Code, a channel designed to help you become a better game developer. If you'd like to learn more about Unity, programming, and game development, then be sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you'll be notified whenever a new video is made available. If we take a look at the hierarchy window, we can see that we currently have 3 selection managers in the scene. And the only thing that's different between them is the selection response. So we have one that highlights, one that outlines, and another one that just places an indicator above the object. And this is what I was talking about in the intro, that in order to try out a new selection response, or even a new selector or array provider, I need to create a prefab or manually swap out an existing selection manager's components in order to match the behavior that I want to test. What I'd prefer to do is be able to hot swap them by hitting a key or maybe exposing a debug button that's only available in the editor. So with that being said, why don't we switch into the code editor and see what we can come up with. Let's start by taking a look at the selection manager. We can see here that we have a reference to iSelectionResponse that gets initialized in the awake method and then used whenever there's a new selection to delegate on deselect and on select to whatever class is implementing the iSelectionResponse. And that's our highlight, indicator, and outline selection responses. But I know that we're going to be prototyping some more of these selection responses, and I don't want to keep having to mess around with my hierarchy in order to test them all. So let's create a composite selection response that will inherit from iSelectionResponse and still call onSelect and onDeselect, but delegate a step further to whichever selection response it's currently pointing to. So to start out, I'll create a new class and call it Composite Selection Response. And first things first, have it implement iSelectionResponse. Now I want to treat this like a component, so I'm going to also have it derived from monoBehavior. Perfect. Now I know I need to have some sort of reference to a list of selection responses, so I'll create a list of those. And I'm also going to need to keep a reference to the current index, so I'll add an int to represent that. All right. Now, in the onSelect and onDeselect methods, all I need to do is delegate the task to the current selection response. So call onSelect and pass down the selection, and do the same for onDeselect. All right, good start. But we may not always have a selection, say if the list changes or is empty. So I'm going to wrap these in an if statement to check that. Let's create a method called hasSelection, and I'll wrap both of these with that. And of course, we'll need to implement hasSelection. And in hasSelection, all I really need to do is just make sure that the current index is valid. So I'll check if the current index is greater than -1 and less than the count of the selection responses list. All right, so the next thing we'll need to do is expose a method that will allow us to call next on this composite selection response so we can cycle through all of the responses. So I'll create a method at the top here. We'll call it next. And in here, we're going to need to increment the current index. But if we just blindly increment it, we're going to go past the size of the selection responses list. So we're going to need to factor that in. So I'll just set current index equal to current index plus 1 modulus the selection responses count. And we're going to need to wrap current index plus 1 in parentheses, so that gets evaluated first. And then for now, just so we can test this really quickly, I'm going to add a context menu called Next. So when we go to test this, we can just right click on the component and click Next and see this in action. But before we do that, we need a mechanism for retrieving these selection responses. Unfortunately, you can't serialize a list of interfaces. It just doesn't work in the editor. So I won't be able to drag the selection responses onto this component manually. So there's a couple ways I could approach this. I could maybe use reflection to instantiate all of my selection responses at runtime, or maybe just instantiate them right here, but I'd like to have a little more granular control. So I think what I'm gonna do is have a game object that's going to hold these selection responses, and then I'm just going to grab the selection responses off of that game object at the start of the scene. So I'll add a reference to a game object that I'll call selection response holder. And then at the start of the scene, I'll go ahead and try to grab a list of all of the selection response components it has. So I'll call get components and then use that to initialize this list. And I'll just inline that so it's cleaner. Perfect. All right, this should be enough to get us started. So why don't we hop back into Unity and see this baby in action. So of course, one last time, we're gonna need to go over to the hierarchy and create a new selection manager. So I'll just duplicate my latest one, disable it, and we'll call this Composite. And remove the indicator selection response and replace it with our new Composite selection response. And like I mentioned before, we're going to need to give it a game object that has all of the selection responses that I care to test. So I'll add a new game object to the scene and call this selection responses. And then since I've already configured 3 of my selection responses, I'm just going to go ahead and right click and copy these components to this object. All right, so now we can go to the selection manager and drag the selection responses object to the selection response holder field on composite selection response. And then if I click on the cog here, we can see that next context menu that I mentioned earlier. And when we run the scene, I'll just go ahead and click this and we can cycle through. Why don't we go ahead and test that now? So we'll press play. Right off the bat, this is a really good sign. We see that we have something working here. Now let's go ahead and test the next button. So I'll go over to that cog and click next. And hopefully that would have called the next function and iterated on that current index. And it did. Look at that. Let's do it one more time. How beautiful. Look at that. So now we're able to iterate over these selection responses, and I can implement as many as I want. And all I really need to do is just drag them onto this selection responses holder object, and I'll be able to cycle through them really quickly at runtime. Except not as quick as I'd like, because I have to still come over here and click this cog and click on next, and I don't know, it's a little annoying. I'd like to be able to just hit a key on my keyboard and cycle through them. So why don't we implement something of a switcher that'll allow us to do that? It shouldn't take that long. So let's switch back to the code editor and see what we can come up with. All right, right off the bat, I want to keep this generic. So why don't we create a class and give it a generic name like switcher? And switcher will be responsible for toggling through all of the options on something like the selection manager, which it'll do in response to some sort of player input. In this case, I think we're just going to keep it simple and use some keyboard input. So let's get started by implementing mono behavior and the update method. And we'll just do a check for input.getKeyDown, and I'll just use the N key for next. All right, now when the N key is pressed, we want to be able to call next on the selection manager, but I don't want the switcher to have a reference to selection manager because it's too tightly coupled. I want to keep this generic, so why don't we create an interface called iChangeable? And we'll give it a method called next. That way, switcher will just have a reference to all of the iChangeable objects in the scene, and it can iterate through them and call next. And to do that, it's going to need to have a reference to a list of these iChangeables. So let's add that. And now we can go ahead and loop through the changeable objects and call next on each one. All right. So similar to before, I'm just going to expose a list of game objects that we can use to just grab the components. Now, obviously, this method has its caveats. You have to set it by hand, and maybe it's not optimized if you had a lot of changeable objects in your scene. But because we're taking an iterative approach, this method works just fine for now. And I'll keep it as a public field so that later on, if I needed some other class to be able to access it and update it, we could do that as well. All right, so in the start method now, we can go ahead and initialize that list. And I'm just going to loop through these. Grab the changeable object, using getComponent, and add it to the list of changeable objects. Perfect. And we really should initialize this list so we don't run into any issues. Perfect. The last thing we need to do before we can test this is have the composite selection response implement iChangeable. And that's it, because the next method is already here, and we can see that we are now implementing it from the iChangeable interface. All right, let's switch back to Unity. And now we can quickly set up the scene by creating a new game object. We'll call it switcher. Add the switcher component, and then add a reference to the selection manager. Perfect. Let's test this out. All right, so we can see by default that we are using the highlighter, but if I were to hit N on my keyboard, we should have triggered the switcher, and there you go. Now the objects are being outlined. And if I hit N again, now the indicators are showing up. But there's one small problem. If I trigger the switcher while I'm currently selecting an object, we can see that it doesn't properly deselect the object. And now we can see that the indicator and now the highlight are still being shown on these two objects. So we can fix that with a real quick change. Let's switch back to the code editor and address that. The problem is that the next method is not updating the object that's currently being selected with the new selection response. So all we have to do to fix that is before we update the current index, we just need to call the current selection responses on deselect method, and then the next selection responses select method. But as you can see, we don't have a reference to the current selection. So now we just need to make a quick update to our code. We're going to add another private field that will store the current selection. So on selection, I'll go ahead and update that field. And same with on deselect. All right, now we can take that selection and pass it on into the next method. All right, let's give that a try. Back in Unity, we can go ahead and press play. And we can see that now that I'm selecting an object, if I hit N on my keyboard, the switcher now correctly toggles through these selection responses. And now it doesn't matter if I have 3 or 100 of these, it's very easy to just test them out and see which ones I like and which ones I don't like in my scene. And this concept doesn't just apply to this particular example, but tooling in general for your game is a really important concept that makes it easier to scale your game for the people who will be designing it so that you're not always digging in the code, but but instead providing tools to higher level team members who may not have programming skills and would prefer to just use an editor that you create for them. In case you didn't know, this video is a part of a series of videos that covers game development and programming topics in Unity. So if you enjoyed it, then you'll definitely want to check out the playlist that can be found in the description. If you like this video, then please leave a like and a comment letting me know what you thought. And as always, I'll catch you in the next video. Thank you to all of my patrons, and a special shout out to Dark Rush Photography, Justin Hurst, NZ, Richard Stantz, Sean Carey, Thomas, Wayne Glows, and Yakov.